Okay, welcome to Romans, Friends, and Countrymen. And this is Allie Pullen, class of 75, with co-creator of Global Citizen, the Global Citizen Festival, and creator of Peak Minds, Michael Trainer, class of 94. Michael,
Hi,
welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
it's a pleasure.
Well, if we can, let's start with Global Citizen and the Global Citizen Festival. Um, Maybe you can explain first about this whole movement and the goals and the purpose and how you became involved.
Certainly, yeah. So after Latin, I went to college out in Maine, Bowdoin College, and there on my study abroad program, I actually wound up studying in Sri Lanka. And during that time, it's a longer story, but I wound up studying with a traditional healer and did a Fulbright scholarship subsequently after graduating. And the traditional healer really talked about the power of community. And in Sri Lanka, there's no real word for privacy. There's no real word for possession. And so being part of a community was integral to the whole. And so I share this story because when we decided to create Global Citizen, the question on our minds was, how do we build a movement to end extreme poverty? And we knew that at that time there were 1.3 billion people on the planet living in extreme poverty, which is basically the equivalent of $1.25 or below all around the planet. And we knew that the traditional narrative, which is kind of, let me guilt and shame you, and instead of having your cup of coffee in the morning, give me that dollar, really wasn't going to be adequate to sustain a large-scale movement. And so to build a movement, we needed to do so through hope and inspiration. And so I went back to sort of one of the more formative experiences in my life, which was my time in Sri Lanka, and really thought deeply about the power of music, the power of community, and what really leads to the gestation of community, because we knew that we as a global community needed to rise to solve some of the now seemingly intractable challenges of our time, although we believe it can be the greatest success story of our generation to see extreme poverty ended in our lifetime. And so to sort of bring this to a head, we decided that we would build a movement, and that movement would be grounded in hope and inspiration and inclusivity. And we embarked on what seemed like a crazy commitment, which was, let's do this, and let's launch it with a festival, because music is such a global and universal language. But let's do it differently than it's ever been done before, and let's make it so to get tickets you have to take actions, and those actions become your tickets. So you couldn't. It wasn't that you would buy a ticket. We weren't asking for your money. We were actually asking for your actions. And then through the policy framework we established, we then utilized those actions to derive multi-million-dollar commitments on behalf of the world's poor. And in fact, in year one, we went from vision to reality, and culminated with a festival on the Great Lawn in Central Park, hosting north of 60,000 people, along with Neil Young, the Black Keys, the Foo Fighters, John Legend sang Imagine, and we had the largest syndicated broadcast of its kind, front page on NewYorkTimes.com, AOL, Yahoo, YouTube, and we raised $1.3 billion in new commitments for programs serving the world's poor.
When I was doing a little research about you, I read that your dad being diagnosed with dementia was one of your motivations to create Peak Mind, which was, I guess, the next thing you did, if I have the order correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I launched, you're spot on. So my dad was one of the most formative figures in my life, obviously, and he and my mother are still together. Actually, they're about to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. So we had a very close family, and when he was diagnosed, it's actually, I said, Dad, I'll take you anywhere in the world you want to go, and he's too humble to say, take me here. So after about 6 months, I said, stamp your passport. I knew he was a great lover of history, and I share that love back to my days with actually Mr. Summers at Latin School.
I was there too.
Great teacher, many great teachers at Latin. And so I knew he would be, and I also knew he loved nature. And so South Africa, I had been to during the World Cup in 2010. I actually went back and took him to South Africa. We had one of the best trips of each of our lives, and celebrated and shared quality time. I always say to friends, if you do one thing in your life and you have a moment, take a loved one on a trip and get that quality time in, because tomorrow's never promised. So I did that, and then on returning, I did actually a 30-day cleanse and meditation to get really clear on what the next chapter would look like. And on the 30th day, I was actually here in Los Angeles, where I live now. I had this kind of crazy idea that I wanted to host the Dalai Lama for his 80th birthday. It actually coincided that his 80th birthday was almost fell on the day with Mandela Day, and I at the time was speaking with Kwaku about how that legacy continues to grow, and basically I thought to myself, I was doing a tremendous amount of research on brain health, and I saw, with Global Citizen, we were focusing on diseases like polio and malaria, a lot of the infectious diseases that were prolific in the 20th century. But I realized with dementia, which is now being called type 3 diabetes, we're looking at a whole new epidemic, which is lifestyle borne. If you look at the United States, half the population nearly is pre-diabetic, and the same is true of China. So we're talking about in 10 years, if certain things don't shift, having north of 1 billion people with a pretty acute, form of diabetes, and that can manifest into all kinds of different sort of autoinflammatory diseases. And so I just got woken up to the possibility of what does this look like. And at the time, I'm not a doctor, but I have plenty of experience researching, so I did a deep dive, and meditation was one of the things I saw had huge efficacy as it related to the brain. Harvard had released a study showing that, as little as 8 weeks of mindfulness, you can decrease the size of your amygdala, your fight or flight center, and increase the size and activity in your hippocampus, which is the center for your creativity. So, long story short, I decided I had this crazy idea I would go after. I didn't know the Dalai Lama. I didn't have a connection to him. But again, what I learned from Global Citizen is if you have a big idea and you're committed to it, and it's bigger than yourself, you can, gather a great team around you, and that's what I did. And lo and behold, it was July 4th of 2015, my mother, my father, my sister, and I were there, and I got to meet and host His Holiness the Dalai Lama for his 80th birthday, and it was the experience of a lifetime. And that kicked off Peak Mind.
That's mind-blowing as well. I mean, when I looked at the list of the people that you were talking to, like the Dalai Lama and Eckhart Tolle and Deepak Chopra, I mean, they're and just bringing all that together, the power of that and the knowledge bank of that is just incredible. And again, I ask you about the challenge of that, of these people are I'm sure amazingly busy and so in demand. And how are you able to bring them in and get their involvement? And it's just it's amazing.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think it's a fair and a great question, and one I get asked frequently. And I don't know that I have a great answer in that. There's been no necessarily magic bullet to the process, except to say that in each instance there was something bigger than myself that we were creating, right? So. In the instance of Global Citizen, it was about building a movement to end extreme poverty. In the instance of the Dalai Lama, I shared a bit about my father's story, how it was inspiring to me, how I realized that there's a similar number of people that will likely be affected, and this is my personal belief and not one I often share publicly, but while we were working on making change out in the world, I came to the realization that ultimately we need to also evolve within ourselves to be able to hold the kind of movements I think that we're going to need to face some of the intractable challenges of our time, whether it be the lifestyle-borne diseases I was talking about earlier, or climate change, or some of the myriad of challenges that we face as we rapidly grow as a global community. And there's kind of it's maybe a not the perfect analogy, but they say many lottery winners, I think it's something like 80% of lottery winners, wind up going back to their default income, because they're not able to, and many pro athletes, because their mindset is oriented towards is oriented in a certain way, and they don't have the mindset of that multi-millionaire orientation, right? And so to me, I felt like, to create the kind of change I wanted to see in the world, I've got to be at cause in creating platforms to actually help people generate the right mindsets to make the kind of behavioral change. I mean, that's the hardest thing. I mean, how many diet books are there? How many, we're all trying to make changes, and it's one of the toughest things in the world. So I slightly digress, but it's to say, I really believe that we can create these behavior changes. And whether we like it or not, in this day and age, those figures that you mentioned are the ones that have the greatest platforms in terms of getting this message out. And so to me, it comes down to having a message that's bigger than ourselves. And then in a tactical sense, I also look at it as, who's your, if I were speaking to someone who was really looking to put together an event, it's kind of, who's your anchor? And by that I mean, in the context of the music festival, it's who's your headliner, right? Because many people go at things looking like, oh, well, this will be great. Whereas if you get, in the context of music, if you get a Jay-Z or a Beyonce, pretty much anyone's going to perform on that stage, because they want to be with Jay-Z and Beyonce. So to me, it's what anchor can you get? Because then also, if you establish yourself with that anchor, then the conversation with the myriad of others who respect that anchor is made far easier, based on sort of demonstrating your commitment and ability to hold space for that particular context.
Growing up, what inspired you to go in this direction? What inspired you to inspire?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I would say, it's what I've been looking at a lot lately is the degree. There's a book that's wonderful, I believe it's by Ryan Holiday, if I'm not mistaken, called "The Obstacle is the Way." And I've been thinking a lot about challenges and how they inform our growth. And this idea that, I think especially in this day and age, there's all kinds of reasons and rationales why people feel oftentimes the victim of something. But I've been playing with this idea of what if everything happens for us rather than to us. And when I was a kid before Latin, I actually was diagnosed with a very significant quote unquote learning disability. And I remember as a kid, I was tracked in sort of remedial classes. So there'd be like 4 of us. And I remember walking by the sort of advanced kids and having this kind of jealousy, or like, feeling less than. And it was actually in 7th grade, and it's a longer story, but when I decided, if I continue to see myself in this light, I don't know where this inner knowing came from, but if I continue to see myself in this light, then I'm going to go down a path without going to. One of my best friends from youth actually wound up joining a gang, and without going into great detail, I knew that if I continued to see myself in that way, it wasn't going to serve me, and it wasn't going to serve others. And so with great support, actually my mother really stepped up. I actually got a tutor. I don't know if Mr. Baker was one of the best teachers I ever had at Latin. And he was just incredible. His partner at the time was my tutor, and she, when I enrolled in Latin in 8th grade, I actually was behind in pretty much all my classes. And it was actually from 8th grade to, I would say, 11th grade, I just absolutely put in work. And I think about that time period very fondly now when I go through challenges, because, I went from someone who had severe sort of, LD and was seen, as an outsider when I came in to ultimately, I remember getting up at 6:30 in the morning, inspired a lot by actually Mr. Baker, because I remember, here's this man who was sort of an Olympic caliber swimmer that wound up breaking his neck and being bound to a wheelchair, and here he was getting up at 5 in the morning in Chicago winters and going and teaching swimming before he even started his day. And I took his amazing Joyce and Ulysses class, and I remember he would have us over to his house, and I just got so enamored and inspired by the process of learning and the notion of a growth-oriented mindset, and being able to continually, regardless of your circumstance, which is what I saw in Mr. Baker, elevating to your possibility. And my belief is that I think all of us, all of us have tremendous possibility beyond even our reckoning. And one of the gifts of Latin was, based on the 7th grade notion of myself, I realized I could totally surpass my governor at that time. I still don't think I have, or many of us have, achieved our true potential, but I know that I'm committed to continuing to operate with the growth mindset and follow the lead of many of the great teachers I had at Latin, and hopefully teach and inspire in my way of being and living, and continuing to learn humbly from those that inspire me. And so I don't know exactly where it came from, but I can say that it has evolved significantly, and I can definitely attribute some of that to the phase of my life where I was at Latin, because it was actually one of the greatest periods of growth in my life. And it also showed me what you can achieve when you combine incredible teachers, advisors, mentors that look out for you, with tenacity and hard work. And that's where a lot of my work ethic was born, and I'm grateful to this day for many of the mentors I was able to learn with.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now? What should we be expecting?
So next up, I'm launching in a month. I'm excited. I'm actually going at the end of in 2 weeks' time. I'm heading down to Necker Island to have a meeting with Richard Branson, which I'm super excited by. There's a gathering around the future of our world's oceans, which we've got to get right. Obviously, ocean plastics are a huge problem, and based on overfishing and a lot of the fishing practices and the rise in global temperatures, there's questions as to whether or not our global fisheries will be able to sustain us in the decades ahead. So I'm excited. I'm going to continue to look at philanthropic work, but my core focus will continue to be around this notion of creating impacts from the inside out, and really working with Peak Mind and some of the thought leaders of our time on creating a platform, which will be like a global citizen, but in the health and wellness and personal development space, an online university, if you will, with some of the best teachers of our time, and really cultivating what I would call sort of 21st century educational paradigm to help people transform their lives. And so really looking at who are the best thought leaders out there, and how can we create courses online so that they can be benefited by people all around the world, and how can we continue to put out information that will serve people globally. And so I'll be launching, I've got about 30 interviews now that will be set to launch on a podcast called the Peak Mind Podcast at the end of February. So depending on when people watch this, it may already be launched. And as well as looking at courses and products that help people unlock their full potential.
Well, thank you, Michael, for taking the time to talk and share with us. This has been fascinating and wonderful and a pleasure. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Ali. I appreciate your time.
Go Romans.